Welcome to 15-Minute Fundraising, raising money broken down in 15 minutes or less.
15-Minute Fundraising is brought to you by Blakely, your partners in fundraising and marketing, helping nonprofits break down barriers and get to the good stuff through integration and authenticity.
And we're your hosts, Waja and Maeve Strathy. What up, fundraisers, and welcome to 15-Minute Fundraising. My name is Waja.
And I'm Maeve Strathy.
And today, we're talking renewal campaigns. So, you've just finished one of your biggest series of campaigns for the year. Holiday is done, your flagship stories are launched, and now you're about to go into the new year. And you have to ask again, so what do? The first thing you do is figure, well, there's been a shift in the time of year, so we need to ask everyone to renew the support that they might have just given over the holidays. So how do we do that? Renewal is a little weird because, for the most part, many people may have already given, but at the same time, we need to make an ask that sounds fresh, sounds interesting, and sounds different than what they've just experienced over holiday. And so we ask to renew. But at the same time, the word renew is a little weird. Historically, it's something that you come back to after an interruption, usually with some sort of vigor. From a kind of mailing perspective, you have the subscription-based services of magazines or nowadays online subscriptions to streaming channels. So renew is a bit strange because when it comes to direct marketing, when it comes to fundraising, we're asking people to come back to us and give again without really saying that. And Maeve, I don't know how you feel about it, but honestly, on some level, this feels to me like one of those moments where we don't really want to say, hey, can you give us more money? So we come up with a bunch of synonyms to make it happen. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So renewal's just always been a bit strange to me.
I hear you. It's an interesting thing, and you mentioned the magazine subscription model because I have to bet, without having done a lot of research, that that's where the renewal in the annual giving world or the direct marketing fundraising world must have come from. This idea that you're kind of a member of something, and we play with that language a little bit with donors, a sense of belonging, that you're part of this, that we need you. So the idea of a gift being a way to renew your support at the beginning of the year, it makes some sense. But to your point, there's some complications around that. There's the fact that the heaviest giving period and heaviest fundraising period just happened. But then there's also the fact that I think that donors kind of, the moment, and this is human behavior too, the moment January 1st sets, what happened before is prologue. We're on to something new, it's a totally different time. And so there is a bit of a reset as well. Now, your point about language is really interesting because it's true. It almost feels like we certainly don't use renewal language, or at least not aggressive renewal language in year-end campaigns. So suddenly we go to kind of this softer word. We're talking about a membership. In many cases, as we know, organizations send out supporter cards or membership cards or donor cards or whatever they are. So there is this kind of sense that it's a softer ask, but I don't know, it kind of sits in this murky territory, doesn't it?
It does. And so I want to talk about this idea of the January 1st switch for a second, right? Because it's a generally held kind of reality that this is the case. That
yes.
January 1st comes around and suddenly we completely switch gears. We forget that everything that's happened before and now we're in a completely new zone. But I guess my question is that backed by science, as it were? Or is that something that someone thought of at some point and that person was a good fundraiser? And so that's just now what we do. We assume that everybody shifts gears. But we see in reality that there are many kind of organizations or approaches that don't use January 1st as, for want of a better word, they're fiscal.
Right. Yeah. And that's the reason I'm actually behind the idea of us resetting on January 1st, because most of the time we find that organizations are leveraging their fiscal year, which often doesn't align with the calendar year, to your point, as this kind of chance to say, there's only 3 months left of our fiscal year, we've almost hit goal. And if your fiscal year ends on March 31st, what the heck does that mean to the donor? It's a totally arbitrary date for them. It's totally internally facing. So actually, that's part of the reason I like renewal campaigns, because everybody does them no matter when their fiscal year starts or stops, and everybody does them in January. And so it's actually paying attention to the donor in a way we often don't. We're actually saying, this is the beginning of your year, the widely agreed upon calendar year. So let's make an ask to renew, because that language actually kind of aligns more with you than sometimes what I find organizations are doing.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. But I mean, you mentioned the language to renew, and I guess that's part of my question. The language in and of itself. I mean, we know as fundraisers what the word renew means, but if you read a renewal letter, I mean, you may get some now and then that say, we need your support once again, but the word renew, the actual word renew, which is also the title of the type of campaign, tends a lot of the time to be used quite heavily in this process. And so what I tend to question is whether a donor who's reading this mailing actually knows what that means.
And that now you're heading into the territory that is the murky bit, in my opinion, in many ways. The word is used heavily. We often use it softly in appeals throughout the year. You're talking to somebody who gave last year, and so you use language, can you renew your support? They gave last year, we want them to give again this year. That's kind of what we call renewal. But then these campaigns, in some cases, I've seen outer envelopes that literally say, 2019 renewal campaign. What the heck does that mean?
Well, exactly.
So yeah, it's a really interesting thing. It's kind of this balance of internally focused, donor focused, but in many cases not very strong across the board. Now, that being said, I also have seen organizations that, interestingly, their renewal campaign and their year-end campaign, and I'm putting them on either side of the calendar in kind of in my mind, imagining, January here and December there. But then again, you also kind of have January there and December there, because they are just a month apart. And yet, in many cases, these organizations are seeing their two most successful fundraising campaigns being year-end and renewal. So there is something about that behavior. And maybe in many cases, it's people who choose to give it the earlier part of the year and other people that choose to give it the year-end. So there is some donor behavior there too. Another point on that note is that we actually prefer, as fundraisers, to have donor files that are balanced with people who are early year givers and year-end givers. Why is that important? It adds this kind of equilibrium to your file that should something really random happen, like a postal strike or something bad happens in the news that really gets in the way of your fundraising results for a while, you don't want to have people focused on one part of the year in terms of giving. If all of your donors only give in December, then if something comes up in December, you might be up the creek without a paddle. So there's also that part to it, is there is some donor behavior elements in the mix of, when people actually prefer to give. So I don't think renewal campaigns neglect the donor. I think they just sometimes head into the territory of being a little too internally facing is probably the biggest problem that I have.
Absolutely. I mean, there's that esotericism that comes with an idea of using what is essentially fundraising jargon in an external appeal or external outreach.
That's right.
But, I mean, you raise an interesting point when it comes to, the balanced donor file. Because immediately when you think of giving 1 month apart, you feel like you're beginning to run the risk of donor fatigue. You've asked a number of times in a relatively short period of time. Because, as you know, it's often not just one ask in December. We usually have, let's say, a holiday-ish, fall-related appeal going out throughout the October-November period. Then we hit year-end in December, and now we're hitting them again in January. And then don't forget the follow-ups that come afterwards.
And never mind all the digital in between, too.
Exactly.
There's in December, I'm sure there's, as many as 10 plus asks, and in many cases, way, way more than that.
So my question is, when you're approaching this idea of building out a renewal campaign and you're looking at the right kind of donors to involve and how you reach out to them, does that balanced file with people who tend to give earlier in the year, tend to give later in the year, does that come about in your experience organically, or is that something that, the other charitable organizations out there should be planning for?
That is a really interesting question. It's kind of a bit of a chicken and egg question because, I think files overall, we do a lot of kind of database benchmarking analysis at Blakely, and we often look at giving by quarter. So like how much of your revenue is coming in, January to March, April to June, et cetera. And every file I've ever seen, the lion's share of their revenue is coming in those last 3 months of the calendar year. There's no question about it. So every file is kind of off balance there. But what you want to avoid is that the other 3/4 of the year are like really way down and then suddenly year end is up. So year end is always going to be up. The middle months are always going to be lower than January to March, but you don't want to see it too off balance. Now, why is that so much higher at year end? Because we ask. So did we condition donors? Did donors condition us? It's kind of hard to say. I have to say it's probably motivated by the end of the tax year more than anything else. I mean, it's just in Canada it's CRA. This is what it's being driven by, or the IRS in the States. You say we need to get our charitable donations in the calendar year made before December 31st. So I think that's where it all started, to be honest. Then you can play to the gratitude we feel at the holiday time, so that plays into it as well. So it makes sense that people give at the year end. But as for the beginning of the year, I think there is some donor behavior at play there. I think it's a little less the way we're approaching it, and a little more that some people make charitable decisions at the beginning of the year and others don't. But I think if organizations were to have only a couple appeals through the year, I would still recommend they be in that first part of the calendar year and the last, even though again they're kind of right next to each other. Those seem to be the times that people are thinking about charitable giving most.
Well, that makes sense. So I guess then the almost obvious question is, what makes a good renewal campaign?
Right.
And almost more so than that, if we can accept that to a degree we're using this kind of internal facing language externally, how do we take the kind of mainstay renewal campaign and make it better?
It's a great question. I think in some ways I'd answer it the way I'd answer how to make any campaign better. How well are we making the case for support? I think in renewal, we actually have to work a little bit harder to make that case. I think, it's because for one thing, they just gave. For another, your year is just getting started. So, do you even know what your priorities for the coming year are as an organization? Can you make that case really well? Because you're going to ask people a number of times again, and they know that. So how is this first ask of the year really going to motivate them to put their support down? And I always think about, making it really does come down to what I was just alluding to, which is what are your priorities for the year ahead? What are hit the ground running January 1st as an organization. You have some serious priorities. What are you going to get to first, and how can donors make an impact there? And why is it so critical that they get in on the ground floor, so to speak, and really make that support early on in the year? How can you make that case in a way that actually matters to your mission and matters to the donor, because the donor at the end of the day is giving because they care about what you do. So what is it that you're doing that they should care about right now, and why is it so urgently needed that they need to give here in January and kind of propel you forward in meeting your priorities? So I think, again, making your strong case and making it really specific to the time of the year and the fact that there's this kind of reset attitude in the air, I think that's really important. In terms of making them better, I think, analyze them for all the BS that we've kind of alluded to around really internally facing, organizationally focused, either language or approaches. Think back to how you can connect it more with the donor, and that speaks to the case for support for sure. But I like I said, I see outer envelopes that say your annual reminder, your annual renewal, your renewal campaign, your annual appeal.
What does that mean?
Exactly. And so I would say if you want to make your renewal campaign better, in addition to making a great case for support, audit it for that internal BS. Make sure that you're not asking to renew because you always have and because it's what others do, but instead make sure you're asking to renew because you've got something donors can make a real impact on now, and that they should be excited about and inspired by, and all the other essential stuff that's behind fundraising. There's the key direct marketing tactics and techniques, and I lean in heavily to those often, but then I have to take a step back and say, will the donor really be excited and inspired by this? Is this about them? Is this about, allowing them to express their values through their giving? And if it's not, then what are we doing here? That's kind of what I'm thinking about when it comes to any appeal, but maybe especially renewal.
I love it. Well, friends, our 15 minutes are up, and that's a wrap. My name is Waja.
And I'm Maeve Strathy.
You stay classy, fundraisers. Oh, and Happy Renew Year.